The letters from the Northern District arrived in clusters through Torrens' commercial network, bundled with freight rate inquiries and supply route assessments and load manifest disputes, and beneath the commercial surface, in the margin notation system that Torrens factors used for the secondary intelligence layer, information of a different kind. Kael had 3 letters from the past 6 weeks. He laid them out on his desk in order of date received, smoothed the creases from the folding, and read the secondary layer in each. Then he set the letters aside and looked at what he had. Prince Caelan, second son, age 23, Northern Military District, Southern Sector Command, 5 years continuous. The assignment dated from his 18th year, immediately following the completion of his court education, at which point someone in the capital's administrative structure had given him a posting and apparently stopped thinking about him. The assignment itself was informative. There were 3 standard career paths for a prince who was not the designated heir: the academy officer track, which led to command visibility and the accumulation of the kind of military reputation that translated into political capital; the Templar attachment, which led to church influence and a specific kind of protected standing; and the frontier posting, which led to neither. The frontier posting removed someone from the capital's field of attention and kept them there. It was the disposition of a family member who did not require managing because they could not reach the mechanisms worth managing. This told him something about the Crown Prince faction's assessment of Caelan 5 years ago. Not the assessment itself. He did not yet know whether Caelan had been evaluated and found unthreatening, or whether the posting had been arranged specifically to ensure he remained so. Both interpretations were consistent with the external record. What the external record could tell him: the Northern Command's supply efficiency. Torrens' freight operation had been running contracts in the Northern District for 4 years, and the secondary notes in the correspondence indicated that Caelan's sector consistently outperformed adjacent sectors on the metrics that freight operations noticed, routes that ran on schedule. Discrepancies that were flagged before they became formal complaints, a specific kind of logistical reliability that was invisible when working and only visible in its absence. He had cross-referenced this against 2 separate commercial operators' records. The consistency was not statistical noise. One Capital Correspondence quarterly bulletin had used the phrase "quietly capable" in a subordinate clause, in passing, in a piece about the Northern District's year-end review. The correspondent had had no reason to note Caelan at all. He wrote in the cipher notebook, "Promising. Secondary intelligence is promising. Promising is not assessment." He read what he had written. The epistemic problem was this: secondary intelligence told you what observers had seen, filtered through what those observers had thought was worth noting. No one in Torrens' freight operation had been looking for the qualities that Kael was looking for. They had been looking at logistical performance, because that was what the freight operation cared about. The Capital Correspondent had been looking for military news with political significance, and had found almost none, and had mentioned Caelan only because the district's annual review required a name. Neither had been looking for how a person responded to being wrong. Neither had been looking for what happened in the space between a principled conviction and a superior's contradictory decision. Neither had been looking for what the quiet was made of. He could build an idealized candidate from this material if he chose to. The profile was consistent with idealization, competent in ways that were verifiable, overlooked in ways that were convenient, distant from the court in ways that read as uncorrupted. He was aware of this and noted the awareness in the cipher notation with the specific shorthand he used for conclusions that required verification before they could be trusted. What he needed: 45 minutes in the same room. Torrens' commercial visit to the Northern District was schedulable. The letter confirming this was on his desk. The visit was organized around legitimate freight business, a seasonal contract review, a supply route assessment for the Guild's upcoming Eastern expansion, and it gave him a viable cover, junior analyst attached to Milo Wren's commercial delegation. His actual name, his actual title, in a context where neither meant anything to anyone at a frontier military post. He was writing the preparation notes when the midday correspondence arrived. Seraphine's letter was in her standard hand, the compressed strokes, the letter forms that carried precision in their structure, the kind of writing that did not waste motion. He read it twice. The primary objective of my operation has been revised. The document retrieval and the noble council positioning are now structured as components of the succession intervention. Justice for my father is a downstream consequence of the succession outcome, not a separate primary goal. Informing you per the Pact's terms, and because the resource allocation for the next 6 months changes accordingly. He set the letter on the desk. He looked at it. He wrote back in the same notation register. I'd already started working on it. He sent it through the afternoon's correspondence route and returned to the preparation notes. Her reply came 2 hours later. One line, of course you had. He looked at this line for a moment. Then he looked at the full span of what she had done, which was not primarily a tactical decision, though it was that too, and not primarily a resource allocation change, though it was that too. She had been running an investigation for 4 years with the shape of her father's death at its center. The investigation had expanded through their combined work until the succession intervention had become the frame that made everything else consequential. And she had looked at this expansion and decided that the frame was the actual primary goal, and her father's death was what mattered within it rather than what it was organized around. She had not diminished it. Downstream consequence was precise, not dismissive, a consequence that would follow from the primary outcome, necessarily and completely, rather than a consequence she was setting aside. The terminology was accurate. What she had done was build a frame large enough to carry the weight without being organized around it. He did not know how long she had been working toward this particular reframing. The note had arrived without preamble, as a statement of fact and a notification of change, because that was how she communicated decisions that had already been made. He filed this observation without examining it further. The preparation work took the rest of the afternoon. He went through the Northern District's geography, its command structure, the regular commercial contact points that would make the freight visit natural. He reviewed what he knew of Caelan's superior, General Helveth, a competent career officer who had spent 12 years in the Northern District and whom Torrens Network described as pragmatic about cost efficiency and somewhat less pragmatic about the officers under his command. He wrote the revised timeline, for weeks to the visit, 2 days at the post, 4 days travel each way. He would need to arrange academic coverage for the seminar sessions he would miss, which could be handled through the standard third-term study travel provision. He would be back before the term's final assessments. He sent the revised timeline to Torren and the coverage arrangement to the Academic Records Office. Outside the window, the Academy's ornamental courtyard was running through the specific transition of early March, the winter cold, still in the mornings, a reluctant warmth arriving by afternoon. The bare branches of the eastern row of decorative trees showed, in certain spots and at certain angles of light, the earliest signs of what would follow. He noted this in the same register he noted everything else. The spatial sense returned from a passive sweep of the surrounding environment, which was habitual and complete and largely subconscious by now. He had been running this kind of passive awareness for 3 years in this building. He would not be running it in this building after June. He thought about that briefly. The Academy was not a permanent condition. It had been a forcing environment, a compressed space where the right people were in proximity and where the intelligence work of 3 years could happen in a way that would have taken a decade from the outside. He had come here to establish himself, identify the Order's presence in the institution, and build the alliances and the intelligence file that the next phase required. He had done these things. The third term's end was also the end of a chapter that had the particular quality of something that could not be extended. He went back to the preparation notes. For weeks to the meeting. He needed to know, before he could build anything further, whether the candidate was what the secondary intelligence suggested or a convenient projection of what the situation required. He would know in 4 weeks. He built the Caelan file over 2 weeks, in the hours between seminars and correspondence work, using everything that Torrens Network had accumulated and everything that his capital contacts had produced and the single usable passage from the correspondence quarterly bulletin. At the end of the 2 weeks, he had 4 pages of dense notation in the cipher he used for irreplaceable material, and he read it twice and thought about it for a day, and then he wrote a clean summary. The summary was 1 page. It was what he actually knew, which was different from the 4 pages, which was what he could infer from what he knew. He started with the established facts. Age 23, second son of the king by the queen consort who had died in Caelan's 12th year. Given the standard noble court education through age 17, after which the record became sparse. Assigned to the Northern Military District's Southern Sector at 18, under the command of General Helveth, 5 years continuous in that posting. No reassignments requested and none issued. No formal complaints, no formal commendations. A clean record in the specific sense of being unexceptional in both directions. The clean record was a fact. What it meant was an inference. He wrote 2 columns. The first column, what a clean record meant if the posting had been designed to manage Caelan's political profile. If someone in the capital's succession management apparatus had looked at the second son at age 17, assessed him as a non-factor, and arranged an assignment specifically to ensure he remained one, then the clean record reflected a successful outcome from the perspective of the faction that arranged it. He would have been given a posting where excellent performance wouldn't reach anyone who mattered and poor performance wouldn't either, and 5 years of that posting would produce exactly the record that existed. Neither a career that could be pointed to as preparation for larger responsibility, nor a failure that could be pointed to as evidence of incapacity. The second column, what a clean record meant if Caelan had chosen the posting. This was the alternative the secondary intelligence couldn't distinguish, and it was the one that mattered more. A second son who had grown up in a court where the succession question centered entirely on his older brother, who had lived for 17 years in the particular position of someone whose relevance to the kingdom's future had been settled before he understood it, might have taken the frontier posting not because it had been arranged for him, but because it was what he preferred. Distance from the capital. Work that had a legible outcome. A context where the thing you contributed was the actual work rather than the performance of the work for an audience. Both columns were consistent with the external record. He moved to the supply efficiency data. Torrens freight operation had 4 years of contract performance records for the Northern District. He had accessed the secondary layer of these through the network's notation system. The key metric was en route incident resolution, the rate at which supply discrepancies, routing errors, and equipment failures were identified and corrected before they required formal complaint escalation. In adjacent sectors, the average resolution rate was 63% within the contracted window. In Caelan's sector, the rate was 81%. 18 percentage points was not a small difference. It was the difference between a sector that ran and a sector that was managed. The question was how much of this was attributable to Caelan specifically versus to the sector's other officers, the quality of the supply vendors, the geographic advantages of the route network. He had tried to separate these variables. The sector's geographic position was not advantaged. It covered the eastern reach of the Northern Military District, which had longer supply lines and more exposure to weather disruption than the other sectors. The supply vendors were the same vendors used across the full district under the same contracts. The other officers in the sector were indistinguishable in their own records from officers in other sectors, which meant the variance had to originate somewhere else. He wrote, "The supply efficiency is attributable, by elimination, to the sector command's organizational behavior. This is consistent with Caelan's direct management. It is also consistent with any competent staff officer under Caelan's command who might be producing the outcome without Caelan's specific direction. I cannot distinguish these possibilities from the commercial record." He moved to the correspondence quarterly bulletin. The relevant passage was embedded in a review of the Northern District's annual performance, a sentence noting that the district's southern sector had outperformed projections by a modest margin, attributed in passing to quietly capable command oversight. The bulletin was read by capital administrators who monitored the kingdom's military districts for the Crown's Administrative Records Office. The correspondent who wrote it had covered the Northern Military District for 6 years and had no commercial relationship with any Crestfall or Crown Prince faction interests. The phrase quietly capable was not enthusiastic. It was the phrase you used when you were noting something without wanting to overstate it, a factual characterization offered by someone who had seen the sector's numbers and used the first accurate description that came to hand. It did not mean impressive. It did not mean remarkable. It meant, there is competence here of a non-spectacular kind. He had used similar phrases himself when writing assessments of sources who were reliable without being exceptional. He looked at the complete summary. The picture was this: a person who had spent 5 years in a position that removed him from the mechanisms of power, who had managed those 5 years with what appeared to be genuine organizational competence, who had attracted no negative attention and very little positive attention, and whose character under pressure, under contradiction, under the specific forms of adversity that mattered for what Kael needed, was entirely unassessed. He sent the summary to Seraphine with a note. "This is what I know. This is not an assessment. What I'm going to the Northern District to do is the assessment." She wrote back within 2 hours. "I've reviewed the secondary intelligence independently through my own channels. The supply record is consistent with what you have. The capital correspondent is credible. The gap in the assessment is accurate." He sent back for weeks. She sent back for weeks. He put the letters in the cipher box and closed the desk. He thought about the gap. The thing about building a succession plan around someone you had never met was that the gap between the secondary intelligence and the direct assessment was the gap between a candidate and a person. The secondary intelligence produced a candidate, a coherent picture of someone whose visible attributes were consistent with what the situation required. The direct assessment would produce a person, which was different, and which might confirm the candidate or complicate it or replace it with something that made the candidate picture look like a projection. He had done enough assessment work in both of his lives to understand that the projection risk was real. He had 3 years of this situation's specific weight, which had compressed into the succession question over the past few months, and he was aware that weight of this kind produced the tendency to find what you needed to find. He had built a check against this into the assessment criteria. The specific qualities he was looking for were the ones that would be visible only if they were genuinely present, not the ones that could be inferred from ambiguous evidence. How Caelan responded to being wrong. How he responded to a superior's incorrect decision. What happened in the space between a quiet person's conviction and the system that overrode it. These were not things that showed up in supply efficiency records. He could not answer these questions from the desk. He wrote this in the cipher notation and left it there. 3 weeks and 4 days until the Torin visit. He moved to the next item in the correspondence queue. The road north took 4 days. Milo Wren was 52, solid through the shoulders, with the specific affability of someone who had been in commercial logistics long enough to have stopped performing it and simply become it. He had been handling Torin's Northern District contracts for 11 years. He knew the roads, the supply posts, the particular personalities of the officers at each garrison. He talked through the journey in the easy, meandering way of someone who was used to long travel and had no objection to sharing a coach with a junior colleague who asked occasional questions and otherwise looked out the window. Kael asked occasional questions. He also looked out the window. He was building his mental map of the Northern District's geography from the physical evidence of the roads, their maintenance quality, the frequency of courier waymarks, the distance between supply stations, the way the terrain shifted as they moved north and east toward the edge of the Thornwald Confederation sphere. By the second day, he had a working operational picture of the region's logistics that confirmed and expanded what the Torin correspondents had told him. Fort Aldenmere was a working military installation. He could see this from the road before they reached the gates. The practical efficiency in how the outer perimeter was maintained, the loading dock on the supply side that showed regular use without showing disorder, the signal relay station on the eastern tower with its flag at the correct position for a non-emergency day. Not a prestigious garrison. Not a place built to impress visitors. A place built to function. Milo presented the commercial delegation's credentials at the main gate. The gate officer was young, competent, incurious about the Torin representative's junior analyst. They were taken to the administration wing and offered water and a 20-minute wait while General Halvatha's aide notified the relevant officers of their arrival. The meeting room was used, the way working rooms are used. The table had a scratch along one end from a piece of equipment moved incautiously. The chairs were mismatched by a degree that indicated replacement rather than original selection. And the wall map showing the Northern District's patrol routes had been updated recently with notations in 2 different hands. 4 officers attended the commercial review meeting. General Halveth, 60, straight-backed and direct in the manner of a career officer who had long since stopped bothering with performed authority. His adjutant, a silver Aura lieutenant who handled the logistics coordination. A supply officer whose name Kael noted and filed. And the fourth, Caelan. He had not been announced by title. Milo's preliminary meeting with the adjutant had named him only as the Southern Sector's commanding officer. He entered behind General Halveth and took the seat on the general's left without ceremony. He was not the kind of person who made an entrance, which was the first thing Kael registered. The quality of moving through a space as though the space were simply there and he were simply in it. 23. Taller than average, with the particular build that came from years of physical military work rather than court training, functional rather than aesthetic, the kind of strength that was a byproduct of the job rather than its own end. The face was the king's in its general structure, the cheekbones and the set of the jaw, but the expression was not the king's. It had a stillness to it that was not composed, not performed, but simply resting. The eyes were doing something Kael catalogued immediately. They moved across the room with the brief sweep of someone who had done threat assessments since they were 18 and had internalized them as habit. He was looking at whether the room was safe. It was a frontier soldier's reflex. He did it without awareness of doing it. Milo opened the meeting with the standard commercial pleasantries. Kael sat 2 seats to Milo's right and slightly back, in the position that was not the lead representative's seat and not the observer's seat, the working junior who would be taking notes. He had a ledger open. He was taking notes. He was also running the most careful human assessment of his 2 lifetimes. The meeting covered the freight contract renewals for the coming year, the supply route adjustments for the Eastern Reach, and a dispute resolution for 2 late deliveries in the previous quarter that had created downstream scheduling complications. Standard commercial work, handled by the military side with competent courtesy. General Halveth listened while his adjutant did the technical response work. The supply officer spoke when the supply question required him. Caelan said nothing for the first 30 minutes. When he spoke, it was to the specific issue of the Eastern supply route timing. The adjutant had proposed a scheduling change that would consolidate 2 of the quarterly delivery windows for efficiency. Caelan said, without looking up from the notes he'd been reading, the consolidated window reduces the Eastern Reach's recovery buffer by 6 days. General Halveth glanced at him. Caelan said, if we need to respond to a Thornwald border incident during the delivery window, the supply reserve drops to 7 days rather than 13 before the next resupply. 7 days isn't enough for a sustained response. The adjutant started to say that border incidents of that scale hadn't occurred in the Eastern Reach in 4 years. Caelan said, the last one was 3 years, 9 months ago. He said it the way you said a number when you were not especially interested in the argument about the number, only in whether the number was accurate. There was a brief quiet. The adjutant checked his own notes. The proposal is the general's call, Caelan said, which was not the same as withdrawing the point. Halveth said, we'll keep the consolidated window. Note the buffer concern. Caelan wrote something in the margin of his notes. He returned to reading. He said nothing further for the remainder of the meeting. Kael wrote in his own ledger, in a notation that was legible as standard logistics tracking and meant something entirely different. The number was in his head, not from notes. He cited it without hesitation because he had been thinking about it recently or because he keeps this class of operational detail current. Neither is possible without genuine engagement with the role. The pushback was not performance. He did not look at anyone when he said it. He said it to the record rather than to the room. When overruled, no adjustment in posture. Continued reading. The meeting ended at 47 minutes. Milo concluded with the standard commercial close. Officers departed. Kael caught one additional detail as Caelan passed the open door on his way out, a folded piece of paper in his left hand, taken from the table's stack of supply manifests, the kind of document that an officer takes because they intend to review it later rather than because it was assigned to them for review. Not the commercial side. Something from the stack that had been left out for the general's use. He had picked it up without comment, tucked it, and continued walking. Kael noted this. Takes work home. The commercial delegation was given quarters in the garrison's visitor wing for the overnight. Kael sat on the edge of the standard military cot in the early evening and looked at the wall. He thought about the two things he had seen, the supply buffer comment and the manner of receiving the overrule. The supply buffer comment was the easier of the two to assess. It was operationally correct. He had run the same calculation himself during the road journey's second day, mapping the Eastern Reach's patrol rotation against the supply schedule that Milo's preliminary materials had outlined. The 6-day reduction was accurate. The 7-day reserve was genuinely insufficient for a sustained border response. Caelan had made this point accurately, with a specific figure, without visibly consulting any document. Either he kept the Eastern Reach's operational parameters in active memory because the work required it, or he had been reviewing this specific question recently for reasons that weren't related to the commercial visit. Both told him something. The overrule told him more. He wrote in the cipher notebook, said what was correct, accepted the overrule without visible frustration, made the record and continued. This is not compliance. He stated the concern in the record's presence specifically so it is there if the buffer question matters later. He is not accepting the general's decision as correct. He is accepting it as the general's decision and ensuring the counterargument exists. He sat with this for a while. Then he wrote, "This is the behavior of someone who distinguishes between what is right and what he can control. He does not perform the former when the latter is absent." He notes it and moves on. He closed the cipher notebook. The spring night came through the window, the northern district's colder version, still with the winter's edge, the stars sharper here than at the academy because there was less to diffuse them. He lay back on the cot and looked at the ceiling, which was the undecorated timber of a functional garrison room. He had 45 minutes. He had used approximately 36 of them in the meeting. He had 9 minutes of observation remaining. He would find them tomorrow. The garrison's morning began at the 5th bell. Kael was already awake. He had run the eastern perimeter road before the 5th bell 5 kilometers, the pace moderate, using the run to map the garrison's physical layout and confirm what the map in the meeting room had suggested about patrol rotation patterns. The guard posts were staffed with the competent routine of a well-maintained installation. Not the slack he had seen at 3 academy-affiliated postings and 2 capital administrative sites, where the routine was present because it was required to be present. Here it was present because the people running it understood what it was for. He came back to the visitor wing, cleaned up, and went to the garrison's public dining room for the morning meal. Caelan was at a table near the eastern window, alone, eating with his left hand and reading with his right. Kael took a tray and sat at an adjacent table without acknowledging him. He was a junior commercial analyst eating his morning meal. He had no particular reason to address the sector's commanding officer. He ate and watched the eastern window light and used the spatial sense to register everything in his immediate radius. The text Caelan was reading was a volume Kael recognized from the Academy Library, Meredith Vossen's analysis of the Northern Frontier Campaigns, a standard military history of the Valdres-Thornwald border conflicts from the preceding century. An undergraduate reading. The standard officer's historical curriculum covered it in the first year. Caelan was not reading it as undergraduate curriculum. He had the book at an angle that allowed him to write in the margins while eating, and he was writing in the margins, and the writing was not underlining or circling, it was argument. Kael could read the nearest notation from his angle without appearing to read it, a vertical margin note in a compact hand that disagreed with the text's analysis of the year 47 supply line failure. The margin note cited a different source. It was wrong about the year 47 failure's proximate cause and right about its systemic one, which was a distinction the original text had not made. He had not been assigned this reading. There was no reason, at a frontier garrison's southern sector command, to be reviewing a 100-year-old border campaign analysis over breakfast. He was reading it because he thought the analysis was incorrect and had been thinking about this long enough that he had brought the book to morning meal. Kael filed this. 20 minutes later, coming out of the garrison supply inspection walkthrough, Milo was reviewing stock levels with the supply officer. Kael was 2 steps back, ledger open, the junior analyst doing his job. He heard the conversation from the adjacent corridor. Caelan's voice and then General Halvatha's. Not the quality of a formal briefing, the quality of 2 people at an impasse that had been reached before and had not been resolved. He walked more slowly. Halvath was saying, the consolidation decision is final. I'm not revisiting it. Caelan said. I'm not asking you to revisit it. I'm noting that if the Thornwald representatives propose the eastern route change at the spring arbitration, we'll be negotiating from a 7-day reserve rather than a 13-day one, and that's a weaker position. Helveth said, You're overestimating the Thornwald side's awareness of our supply schedule. Caelan said, Possibly. A pause. I'd like authorization to keep a secondary reserve at the Aldenmere cache rather than moving it to the main depot. Helveth said, That's extra administrative overhead. Caelan said, It's a different kind of overhead from responding to a supply shortage during an active arbitration period. Silence. Then Helveth said, I'll think about it. Caelan said, Thank you. That was the end of it. Kael walked on toward the supply room and arrived 3 seconds before Milo finished his introductory exchange with the supply officer, and he opened his ledger and wrote the figures Milo was dictating and thought about what he had heard. Helveth had not agreed. Caelan had not withdrawn. He had found a different formulation of the same problem, not the original proposal, which had been rejected, but a narrower version that addressed the core risk through a different mechanism. Secondary reserve at the forward cache rather than reorganizing the supply window. Not the full solution, but the half solution that fit within the system's current constraints. He was working with what he had. Kael wrote in the ledger, in the notation that read as supply figures, finds the partial solution when the complete one isn't available. No resentment in the second approach. It's not a concession, it's a different angle on the same problem. He's been doing this for 5 years. He spent the supply inspection working through this. The thing about 5 years in a posting where your superior's decisions could not always be correct and your own correct assessments could not always be implemented was that it produced one of 2 outcomes. Either the person stopped making correct assessments, because there was no institutional reward for them, and making them repeatedly without effect was demoralizing, or the person continued making them through a different mechanism, noting them in the record, finding partial solutions. Maintaining the underlying analysis regardless of whether it reached the decision level. Caelan was doing the second thing. 5 years of it. Without an audience. The last piece arrived after lunch. He was crossing the garrison's central yard when he passed Caelan speaking with 2 junior officers, his own people, from the southern sector, who had come to Aldenmere for a logistics review and were finishing it before the return ride. The conversation was not about supply chains. It was about one of the junior officers' assessments, which had apparently been questioned in the logistics review, and the junior officer was explaining his reasoning with the particular stiffness of someone who expected to be dismissed. Caelan listened through the explanation. Then he said, You're right about the route choice, but the timing calculation is off by a day. Here's why. He explained the timing. He was direct without being condescending. He corrected the calculation without treating the error as evidence of a larger inadequacy. The junior officer made a note. Caelan said, The route choice was good reasoning. Fix the calculation. He moved on. Kael stood in the yard for a moment. He was aware of something that had the quality of confirmation rather than discovery, something he had been building toward across the 45 minutes of the meeting and the 14 additional minutes of these separate observations, and which had now arrived fully. Caelan knew he was right, in the meeting room and in the corridor and in the yard. He was not performing certainty about being right, and he was not performing humility about it either. He was simply accurate about what he knew and accurate about what the system would currently allow, and he operated within that gap with the specific kind of integrity that did not require acknowledgement to persist. He had not been corrupted by the court. The court had never bothered with him. He had been at a frontier garrison for 5 years, and he had been quietly, consistently, accurately himself, and no one had tried to teach him otherwise. Kael went back to the visitor wing. He sat down and took out the cipher notebook and wrote the assessment. It took 20 minutes. When he finished, he read it once. Then he put the notebook away and began preparing to leave in the morning. The spring light through the garrison window was thinning into early evening, the particular quality of northern spring light that was longer than winter light and still colder than southern spring, clear and direct and without sentiment. He looked at it for a while without thinking about anything in particular. The writing was done. The assessment was done. The 4 days south began tomorrow. He had what he came for. He wrote the full assessment on the second day of the road south, in the coach while Milo dozed against the window, with the cipher notebook on his knee and the particular productive momentum of a judgment that had clarified during the overnight. The assessment was 3 pages. The first page was what he had confirmed. The secondary intelligence was accurate in its characterizations, not inflated. The supply efficiency was attributable to Caelan's direct management in the way the data had suggested. The quietly capable descriptor was, if anything, conservative. It was the description of someone who had not been watching Caelan carefully. Watching him carefully produced a different picture. The second page was the qualities he had needed to observe directly, and what the observation had found. Response to being wrong: 2 instances in which Caelan was not wrong, 0 instances of error observed. Response to a superior's incorrect decision: accepted twice without visible frustration, worked around once through a partial solution, maintained the correct position in the record throughout. Response to a subordinate's error: corrected the calculation directly, assessed the underlying reasoning separately and accurately, did not conflate the error with the reasoner. Disposition toward the work: continued beyond formal obligation, the book at breakfast, the supply manifest taken from the table. The work was not something he left at the end of the day. The third page was the inference layer. He had 3 flags here, in the notation he used for conclusions that were supported but not certain. The first flag, Caelan's willingness to work within the system's constraints rather than against them, might be a function of the current context, in which the system was a functioning military installation with a capable, if inflexible, superior. A different context, one with a larger stage, higher stakes, a more consequential form of overrule, might produce different behavior. He did not know how Caelan would respond to being overruled by a noble council that was serving the wrong interests. He had not seen that. The second flag, the political dimension. Caelan had no political experience. The court had never given him reason to develop it. The quality of political judgment, who to trust, when to move, how to manage the specific forms of pressure that capital politics applied, was not something a frontier garrison produced. He would need to be supported in this, substantially, for longer than would be ideal given the timeline. The third flag, he did not know what Caelan wanted. He had observed a person who was doing his job well, and had no visible agenda beyond doing his job well. He did not know if this was genuine, if Caelan was simply not interested in power except as a vehicle for service, or if it was a cultivated posture, or if it was the absence of ambition that came from someone who had never been given reason to develop it. The secondary intelligence had the correspondence quietly capable, but capable for what, toward what, in service of what larger frame, was not something the secondary intelligence had addressed, and was not something he had been able to directly assess in a 40-minute commercial meeting and a garrison's common spaces. He would need to work with the uncertainty. He wrote at the bottom of the third page, "This is viable." The uncertainty flags are real and should not be dismissed. But viable with known uncertainty is substantially different from not viable, and the alternative is not a candidate who clears the flags. It is no candidate at all. On the 4th day south, back at the academy, he wrote the summary version. 1 page, compressed notation, no inference flags. He sent it to Seraphine through the afternoon correspondence. He waited. Her reply came the next morning. She had been waiting for it. "I've reviewed the assessment. The 3 flags are accurate. I have independent intelligence that supports the political experience gap. The question of what he wants I cannot resolve from secondary intelligence. I accept the viable with known uncertainty conclusion." Then, separately, is he capable of governing this kingdom through the transition period? He thought about this question for a long time before answering it. Not because he didn't have an answer, he had had the answer since the garrison yard, but because the question deserved the time it would take to say the answer precisely. He wrote back, "He is capable of learning to govern through the transition period." That is not the same answer, but it is more accurate. What I observed was not a king. He has never been in a position that produced what a king requires. What I observed was someone who has been consistently and accurately himself for 5 years in a context designed to make that difficult, and who has found the partial solutions when the complete ones weren't available, and who corrects the calculation without dismissing the reasoning, and who takes the work home in the literal sense. This is raw material. What comes after is development. She wrote back within an hour. What does development require? He wrote, "Time we don't have and people he can trust and a reason that makes the thing he's being asked to do larger than what he would choose on his own." She wrote, "Can we provide the reason?" He thought about this for a while. He wrote, "Yes." Not by explaining the political situation to him and asking him to cooperate with it. By showing him what's at stake in a context where he can assess it himself. He's not the kind of person who follows someone else's judgment about what matters. He's the kind who needs to see it. She wrote, "Then the noble council positioning creates the conditions for that. When the moment comes, he'll see it." He wrote, "Yes." There was a pause in the correspondence that had the quality of something decided. He looked at the sentence on the desk, "Yes," and thought about what it meant to have placed a person in the category of succession candidate without their knowledge and to have confirmed the placement from evidence. It was a different thing from how succession worked in the mechanisms of the kingdom. It was a different thing from how he had planned his own survival in those early years of the barony. He was making a judgment about who should hold the highest power in the kingdom based on 45 minutes of observation in a freight inspection meeting, and the judgment was correct, and the correctness of the judgment did not make it a smaller thing to have made. He put the correspondence in the cipher box. He wrote to Torin that night, a thank you for the northern visit, a note about the route assessment findings for the commercial report, and beneath the commercial air, a request to begin developing Caelan's public profile through the Northern District's performance documentation. Quietly. Gradually. In the ways that created a record that was findable when someone asked the right question. He sealed the letter and added it to the correspondence route. Outside the window, the Academy's courtyard was in the full push of April spring, the bare branches of his first March now fully leafed. The ornamental trees in the white and pink of the brief flowering week before the petals dropped and left the green that would last until autumn. He noted this and filed it and went back to work. They had confirmed the candidate. The long game had a name now. The problem with positioning a prince the court didn't watch was that the court's inattention was a double-edged condition. It meant the crown prince faction wasn't monitoring him, which was necessary. It also meant there was no existing mechanism through which his qualities could become visible to the people who needed to see them. He and Seraphine worked through this problem in the correspondence across the first 2 weeks of May. She wrote, "The Noble Council doesn't know Caelan exists as a political entity. The houses that are neutral on the succession question haven't considered him. The houses that are watching the question closely are watching the crown prince." She had been positioning within the council for 2 months already, through the standard house-boss relationship network. The framing was straightforward. She was maintaining the house-boss political presence in the council's ongoing discussions, which was something the Voss heir was expected to do, which made it unremarkable. What she was doing within that unremarkable frame was more precise. She was surfacing, in the right conversations, the question of succession preparedness. Not who should be king. That question was premature and politically dangerous to raise. But what does the kingdom require in the next transition period? What capabilities would serve it best? What historical examples demonstrate successful versus unsuccessful transition management? The argument underneath the question was structural. Any house considering its position relative to the succession should be thinking about these qualities, and those qualities pointed towards specific things. She did not name Caelan in these conversations. She did not need to. When the right house, in the right conversation, eventually asked who in the current royal family most closely embodied those qualities, the answer would be findable. She was making it findable. He read her description of this approach in the correspondence and wrote back, "You're not running a succession campaign. You're creating the conditions in which the right question produces the right answer." She wrote, "Yes." He wrote, 3 houses after the graduation speech. "How many now?" She wrote, 5, potentially. House Stormwall and House Everin are confirmed. House Davith is moving. There are 2 others in early conversation that I'm not ready to classify yet. He wrote, "The Crown Prince faction's awareness?" She wrote, "None that I can detect." The Noble Council work is consistent with standard house-boss relationship maintenance. I have been doing this for long enough that the pattern doesn't read as new. He wrote, "How long?" She wrote, "I started the Noble Council positioning 18 months ago, before we formalized the pact. I didn't have the succession candidate at that point. I had the succession problem." He considered this. She had been running the Noble Council positioning for 18 months. Before they had shared intelligence. Before the pact. Before the complete picture. She had identified the succession problem from her father's investigation, before she had the full shape of what her father had found, and she had begun building the political groundwork for a response whose specific form she had not yet determined. He wrote, "You built the infrastructure before you had the plan." She wrote, "A principle my father mentioned once, build the channel before you know exactly what will flow through it." He read this twice. He thought about Lord Commander Aldrich Voss, who had been in the Lord Commander's position for 10.5 months, who had identified the Crown Prince problem in the first months, who had been building his evidentiary chain through the Capital Court's intake system when they killed him. He had been working fast because a Lord Commander who has identified something that large cannot afford to be careful in the way that a daughter with 4 years can afford to be careful. She had taken the time her father hadn't had. She had built what he hadn't had time to build. The third week of May, final term assessments. The Academy's standard end-of-year examinations, which were a different kind of assessment from the one he had just completed in the Northern District. He took them, performed in the expected range, solid, unremarkable, consistent with his established standing, and moved through the remaining weeks with the particular quality of attention that came from having the real work happening in a different register from the visible one. 5 houses on the council. Torrens documentation in process. The correspondent primed. The document retrieval path under continued development through Seraphine's House Boss archive contact, kept in reserve, not yet deployed. The 6-month designation window was ticking. Graduation was in June. He thought about this sometimes in the mornings, running the Academy perimeter one last time, the morning light on the courtyard stones. He had walked into this building 3 years ago at 14 with a collection of carefully constructed invisibilities. He was walking out of it at 16 with what he had actually come to build. The building was done. The next part was different. His father arrived the morning before the ceremony. Kael went to meet him at the Academy gate. Aldrich Ashford was 51 now. Kael worked this out automatically, the way he worked out most things involving people he cared about, noting the current number and holding it, and he looked better than he had looked in years. The barony's improved state showed in his bearing, the particular straightness in the shoulders that came from worry lifted rather than from effort applied. He was wearing the Ashford colors, the iron gray and forest green, in the clean dress version that Kael had seen his father save for occasions requiring it. He was proud. Kael registered this before his father had covered half the distance from the gate to where he stood waiting. It showed in the quality of the walk, the restrained version, the version that was trying not to show how much this mattered, which was itself the most complete evidence of how much it mattered. He stood at the gate and watched his father walk the last 50 feet and thought, he doesn't know what any of this was actually for. He knows the shape of it, the 3 years, the letters, the gradual change in what it was possible to discuss at the barony without alarming anyone, but he doesn't know the shape underneath the shape, and he is not going to know it for some time. And the look on his face right now is for the thing he can see, which is his son at the Academy's graduation gate wearing the correct clothes and looking approximately healthy. Aldrich reached him and put his hand on Kael's shoulder. A brief, solid pressure. The gesture he used when words were adjacent to what he meant, but slightly less accurate. He said, "You look well." Kael said, "The 3rd year was good." Aldrich said, "I can see that." They walked together toward the visitor reception point. The ceremony was held in the Academy's main hall. 300 students in year-specific seating, families in the tiered gallery, faculty in the front row facing them. The hall had been built for exactly this purpose and did its job without excess. High ceilings for the acoustic quality, windows positioned for the June afternoon light, the floor arranged to give each family a clear sight line to their student. Kael sat in the 3rd year student section and watched the proceedings with the part of his attention that was available for watching proceedings, which was not the largest part. The official results were read in alphabetical order by standing. His name fell in the upper middle section, a solid academic record, 1 notable tournament appearance 3 years ago, 2 academic commendations in the history and political economy tracks. The commendations were genuine. He had chosen them deliberately, because being genuinely good at one or two things was more credible than being uniformly adequate at everything. There was polite applause from the gallery section where the frontier noble families were seated. He listened to the applause and thought about what the official record said versus what the 3 years had actually produced. The official record said, upper middle academic standing, no aura track honors, general track student who had managed to distinguish himself mildly in 2 academic areas without standing out enough to attract sustained attention. What the 3 years had actually produced, an intelligence file spanning 12 independent capital sources and 4 regional networks, an information sharing arrangement with the heir to the kingdom's most powerful noble house, a succession candidate identified, assessed, and under active positioning, a document retrieval architecture under development for a sealed royal archive section, a confirmed picture of the organization responsible for Lord Commander Voss's murder, the destruction of one order asset within the academy itself, and the most comprehensive understanding of the kingdom's current political situation held by anyone under the age of 30 who was not living in the palace. The gap between the official record and the actual one was the whole point. The official record existed because it had to exist. An academy student who had left no trace at all would have been more suspicious than one who had left the correct trace. The actual record existed because the work had been done. He was not troubled by the gap. He would have been troubled by its absence. He sat in the hall and watched the remaining names be read and thought about the succession timeline and the Noble Council's current state and the document retrieval's next step and whether Torrens' northern correspondent documentation would be ready in time for the council's summer session. He thought about these things in the specific ordered way that allowed him to work through them in parallel, which was a habit so established now that it was simply his mental texture. Then the last name was read, and the hall shifted from ceremony mode to what came next, and he let the working through stop and looked at the room he was in. 300 students. Faculty he had learned, in some cases, to genuinely respect, Professor Aaron in combat technique, who had never been fooled by his performance, but had never pressed it into the light either. The dean, who was a political creature in the specific sense of someone who had kept an institution functional in difficult conditions. Lyra across the hall in the scholarship student section, who had turned and found his eye and made a brief expression that conveyed approximately 4 things at once, including genuine relief that they were both still standing. Damien Cross in the Church of Light's sponsored section, who was looking at something outside the window with the particular quality of distance that Kael had been monitoring for 2 years, and which was more pronounced this year than last. And in the front left position, where the top student of the class stood to give the traditional address, Lady Seraphine Voss, 2nd year of the advanced track. Sitting with her full attention on the ceremony and the particular quality of settled focus, that meant she was working in at least 2 registers simultaneously. He had walked into this building 3 years ago, and she had walked past him in the library corridor and had not moved aside, and he had moved aside and watched her go and thought, she is not what the story said. He had not been wrong about that. The ceremony moved to the address. He watched her walk to the front of the hall. She stood at the front of the hall with her hands at her sides, and she looked at the room, and the room went quiet in the way rooms went quiet when they recognized something that did not require prompting. This was the traditional top student's address. The format was established, a prepared speech, typically 8 to 12 minutes, on the theme of service and future obligation, delivered to families and faculty and the graduating class. It was the kind of address that produced polite applause and was forgotten before the reception. She waited until the room settled. Then she began. The address opened with a historical question: what made a succession work? She framed it academically as an inquiry into the kingdom's historical record, 3 examples from the past 2 centuries where succession had been managed well, 3 where it had not. Standard historical curriculum, familiar to the faculty and to the noble families who took their children's education seriously. She walked through the 6 examples with the precision that House Voss brought to everything, each case summarized cleanly, the key variable identified, the outcome stated. Kael identified the argument in the 2nd paragraph. The 3 successful successions shared a single feature. In each case, The process had prioritized the kingdom's continuity over any faction's preference. The key figures in those successions had backed the candidate who was best positioned to govern the coming transition period rather than the candidate whose ascension best served their immediate interests. In the three failures, the reverse was true. The historical lesson the address drew from these cases was about the role of the educated class, students, administrators, scholars, the people in this room, in maintaining the kingdom's institutional capacity to make that distinction. On the surface, this was a speech about civic responsibility in the abstract. Beneath the surface, the argument had a specific shape. The three successful successions had been ones where a second or overlooked candidate had been elevated when the primary candidate proved inadequate. Two of the three failures had been ones where an invested faction had prevented that elevation at the cost of the kingdom's stability. The historical examples were not invented. They were real, accurately summarized, and entirely inarguable as historical record. Their selection was not random. She was not naming the crown prince. She was not naming Caelan. She was constructing, in historical terms, the argument that a second candidate with genuine capability should be considered when a primary candidate's adequacy was in question. And she was constructing it in a context where the educated class of the kingdom was gathered and listening and would carry the argument back to the noble council discussions where it would matter. He tracked each of the three noble houses he had identified as her target audience. House Stormwall. The head of house was in the gallery, second row, with the specific expression of someone filing a speech into the category of things that will require discussion at home. Not a reaction to the surface content. A reaction to the subtext. Stormwall had been watching the succession question carefully because their northern border position gave them a particular stake in the kingdom's capacity to respond to the Ironmark Empire's continued pressure. They had been neutral. They were thinking. House Everin, the head of house's eldest son, who was attending on behalf of the family because the head of house was traveling. The son was young, and his attention had the quality of someone who was following the argument structure because he had been trained to follow argument structure, and he was following it. He would report home. What he reported would be accurate. House Davith. He spotted the Davith representative 3 rows back from the Everin contingent. Middle-tier house, still calibrating their succession position. The representative was leaning forward slightly, which in the posture vocabulary of the nobility's formal occasions was the equivalent of taking notes. He moved his attention to the Crown Prince faction's contingent. They were in the gallery's right side section, as they were always positioned at official events where positioning conveyed alignment. 7 families, the relevant ones. He watched their faces through the address. They heard a graduation speech. They heard historical examples. They heard a capable young woman saying intelligent things about civic responsibility. They applauded at the appropriate points. None of them showed the specific quality of attention that indicated recognition of subtext. She had calibrated the surface content precisely enough that the faction it was aimed at didn't see it while the faction it needed to reach did. He thought about this while she continued. The precise calibration was not luck. It was the result of having spent 2 years in this institution knowing which faculty members talked to which noble families, which family contingents were sophisticated enough to hear argument structure, and which were attentive only to explicit content. She had built the speech for the room she actually knew rather than the room she was officially addressing. She finished at 11 minutes. The applause was sustained, which was unusual for a graduation address, because graduation addresses typically received polite applause and nothing more. What the sustained applause indicated was that the room had found the speech better than expected without necessarily being able to say why it was better. He sat in the third-year section and did not applaud until the second beat, which was when the graduation class as a unit began. He looked at his hands briefly and thought, 3 houses were where she had been 4 weeks ago. She had just moved 2 more and put a third in motion. She walked back to her position in the front row with the specific quality of someone whose full attention had moved on to the next thing. He watched her sit down. The ceremony concluded with the academic registrar's formal reading of the graduating class's names for the record. His name was read, 4th in alphabetical order, and the recording was made, and that was the official end of his time at the Valdris Royal Academy. He sat in the hall while the reading continued and looked at the June light in the windows, which was the particular deep summer quality of light that existed for approximately 3 weeks before it shifted into the flat bright of July. And he thought about the last 3 years in the way he thought about things that were both done and still happening, present as lived experience, past as category. The reading finished. The ceremony ended. Families moved toward their students. His father was already making his way down from the gallery. He stood and watched his father come, and he thought that there were some things the official record would never contain, and some things it never should, and the gap between them was the place where everything that actually mattered had happened. The reception was in the Academy's formal garden, which in June was at its full state. The ornamental plantings in the second bloom of the season, the paths swept and the stone chairs arranged at calculated social intervals. The late afternoon light doing the correct things for an occasion of this kind. Families and graduates moved through the garden in the specific social pattern of the post-ceremony event, the business of being seen together, the conversations that were also assessments, the children watching their parents navigate the room and learning from the watching. His father was doing well. Aldrich moved through the garden with the quiet good manners of a man who was genuinely interested in the people he spoke to. This was his particular gift and his particular limitation. The genuine interest was real, which meant the conversations were real, which meant he spent the first hour actually talking to the families of his son's fellow graduates and a retired faculty member and a merchant guild representative who had come for the scholarship students portion of the ceremony. He could not network. He could only converse. The people he spoke with invariably liked him. Kael moved through the garden adjacent to his father, tracking the social geometry, noting which families were speaking with which other families and what the cluster patterns implied about the noble council positioning Seraphine had been running. 3 of the families he identified were ones whose presence at a graduation event in this configuration was interesting. They did not typically attend academy events, or had not attended in the previous 2 years. And their presence today was either coincidence or a response to an invitation that had made the attendance worth their time. He was running this as background processing while speaking to Mira from the study group, who had graduated with a commendation in applied mathematics and was going to the capital's administrative service, which was the correct outcome for Mira because she was the kind of person who would become very competent in a formal institutional structure and would produce reliable and excellent work within it and would be genuinely happy with that. He told her this in different words, and she said something accurate about him in return, and they shook hands with the mutual understanding of people who had been colleagues in a real sense and had the specific respect for each other that came from that. He moved on. Duke Crestfall arrived through the main garden gate at the 3rd hour. He registered this from 20 meters away, through the spatial sense, the specific quality of a gold aura practitioner moving through a social space with the unconscious projection that gold aura produced when its holder was accustomed to rooms adjusting around them. The Duke had been a donor to the Academy's scholarship fund for 8 years, which gave him a legitimate presence at graduation events and was almost certainly why he had chosen this mechanism to maintain a capital social footprint. The philanthropist donor was a cleaner public profile than the frontier land predator. Kael assessed the geometry of the garden and found his father. Aldrich was near the eastern path, speaking with 2 other frontier lords who had also come for the graduation. He was animated, which meant the conversation was one he genuinely liked, probably something about frontier politics, the Eastern Compact's upcoming seasonal meeting, the specific problems of managing a baronial administration in a year when the capital's attention was turned inward. Aldrich was good at this kind of conversation. He was good at the things he actually knew, and he knew the frontier. The Duke moved through the garden with the practiced ease of someone who had been navigating social spaces of this kind for 40 years. He spoke with 3 families near the main path, received their attention with the comfortable authority of a major donor at an institution that valued major donors, and then moved east. Toward Aldrich's cluster. Kael moved to a position that was not adjacent but was within clear earshot, the path near the yew hedge that had the specific acoustic property of the surrounding stone, which carried sound with reasonable fidelity from 15 feet. He appeared to be reading the inscription on the stone planting marker. He was not reading the inscription on the stone planting marker. The Duke arrived at the cluster with the momentum of a man who expected to be received. Aldrich looked up. His face did the specific thing it did when he was not surprised, but was not prepared either. A brief internal recalibration that was visible only in the half-second before the correct expression settled. He had prepared, somewhat, for the Duke's potential presence. He had not prepared enough, because the Duke had apparently decided that graduation day was the appropriate occasion. The conversation opened with the standard pleasantries of men who knew each other in the specific way that a creditor knows a debtor, not friends, not enemies. Something with a precisely established power differential that both parties understood and that shaped every word. Aldrich was calm. He was good at calm. He had been managing this specific relationship for 8 years. The Duke was not there to discuss loans. He said, in the genial tone of someone sharing an observation rather than making an attack, "You must be pleased, a good 3 years for the Ashford boy." He glanced at the garden, a gesture that took in the graduating students and their families. Though I sometimes wonder about these academy classes. Half of them are frontier families at this point. Places that could go to the capital house's secondary sons. A pause, and then, lighter, almost amused, frontier defectives taking up space better families could use. There'll be a review of the scholarship criteria at some point, I imagine. The phrase landed in the cluster with the specific quality of a thing said too clearly to be denied and too casually to be formally addressed. Aldrich's face changed. It did not change to anger. It changed to the expression that came before anger in a man who had been managing his own anger for years. The expression that meant he had registered the wound and was deciding whether to absorb it or respond to it. He absorbed a great deal. He had been absorbing this particular form of thing for a long time. He was about to say something measured, something that maintained the surface courtesy while containing some fraction of what he was actually feeling. Because he was Aldrich Ashford, and he had been doing that his entire adult life, and it was the response he had available. The two frontier lords in the cluster had gone slightly rigid. The space in the garden around the cluster had developed the specific quality that social spaces developed when something was happening that the observers recognized as significant and were watching to see the outcome of. Kael was 12 feet away. He had been running 3 parallel assessments since the Duke entered the garden, and one of them had included the possibility of this exact conversation, and he had noted it. And he had done nothing to prevent it because preventing it would have required disclosing surveillance of a Duke's movements at a graduation event, and because he had understood, when he flagged the possibility, that the Duke coming to this conversation was the Duke making a choice about what this day was for. He had his own view of what this day was for. He set down the planting marker and walked the 12 feet to the cluster with the unhurried pace of someone who had simply finished reading what he was reading and was rejoining his father's conversation. He arrived at Aldrich's left shoulder. He smiled at the Duke with the polite expression of a young man being introduced to someone his father knew. His father looked at him briefly. The briefest look. The look that meant, "I don't know what you're about to do, and I trust you to do it." Kael looked at Duke Crestfall. He said, in a conversational tone, the way someone shared an observation that had come to mind, "I've been meaning to raise something with someone who has contacts at the Royal Council Review Board." The Duke's attention shifted to him in the way attention shifted to someone who had introduced themselves into a situation, a brief recalibration, a reassessment of the social geometry. He looked at Kael with the practiced courtesy of a man in his position acknowledging a much younger, much less significant person who had spoken to him. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced," the Duke said. "Kael Ashford," Kael said. "My father is Baron Aldrich." He said it the way you said a thing that was simply true. No weight added to it. No inflation of the title. No attempt to produce dignity from the words themselves. The Ashford name was what it was. He was not going to perform around it. Of course. The Duke's tone had the specific warmth of someone who had already placed the name in its correct category and was applying the correct level of social attention to it. Minimal but present. "Congratulations on the graduation." "Thank you," Kael said. He looked thoughtfully at the middle distance, which was the expression of someone developing a thought. "The Royal Council Review Board. You have contacts there." The Duke looked at him. "The annual regulatory review," Kael said. "For the noble house's commercial and administrative filings. I'm sure you're aware of the process." I am aware of the process, the Duke said, in the tone of someone who was aware of the process and was not certain where this was going and was about to become more certain. The third quarter filing for year 10, Kael said. The Crestfall Duchy's Mineral Rights Revenue Declaration. He said it as he said everything in the same conversational register, the way you would mention a document you had been reading recently. There's a 38,000 coin discrepancy between the declared figure and the independent assay office numbers from the same quarter. The assay office reports quarterly to the Kingdom's Geological Survey, which archives them separately from the declaration record. The garden cluster had gone very quiet. He continued at the same pace. The Eastern Freight routing irregularity is more recent, year 11. The declaration shows the standard transit rate for Eastern Corridor commercial traffic, but the actual freight volumes routed through the Crestfall Duchy's registered corridor show a different pattern. A discrepancy of that kind, between declared transit volume and actual transit volume, could reflect administrative error in the reporting cycle. It happens. He paused, the way someone paused when they were moving to the next item in their own thinking. The Year 9 interest arrangement through the Callaway commercial note, though, he said. That one is structured somewhat differently. The Noble Council's anti-usury provisions, specifically the provision addressing Noble House lending structures applied to obligated counterparties, have a specific definition of prohibited rate arrangements. The Callaway note structure falls within that definition. The current penalty framework for a confirmed violation is written into the Council's founding charter. He looked at the Duke. He looked at him with the expression of someone who has just finished sharing an interesting observation and is available for the other person's response. Duke Crestfall had turned white. Not the white of someone who had been surprised. Kael had been precise about reading the distinction for years. The surprise white was a brief physical response, a temporary blanching that recovered in seconds. What the Duke was showing was a different kind of white, the white of someone who had been standing in a room they believed was empty and had discovered it was not, and was calculating how long it had not been empty, and was realizing that the duration was longer than they had time to address. The cluster had not moved. The two frontier lords were very still. Several people from adjacent clusters had oriented in the direction of the conversation without visibly deciding to do so. Kael said, "But I'm certain there are reasonable explanations for all three. I look forward to hearing them at the next Royal Council review." He smiled. He looked approximately 16 years old. He had the open, pleasant expression of someone who had just had a genuinely interesting conversation and was grateful for the opportunity. Duke Crestfall said nothing. The duration of that nothing extended past the point where it was a pause and into the territory where it was a statement. His face had moved through several things in the past 30 seconds and had arrived at the specific expression of someone who was managing a situation they had not anticipated and for whom the only available move was an ordered withdrawal. He looked at Kael for one additional moment with the quality of assessment of a man running the calculation about what he was looking at and what that meant for decisions that had already been made, and then he said, to the cluster, not to Kael specifically, "If you'll excuse me." He crossed the garden toward the far exit at the contained speed of someone who had decided the only correct action was departure and was executing it with as much control as the situation permitted. No one in the cluster spoke for a moment. Aldrich's hand found Kael's shoulder, the same gesture from the ceremony, from the gate that morning, and rested there for 3 seconds, which was longer than it usually rested, and then released. The frontier lords in the cluster exchanged the brief look of people who had witnessed something they needed to discuss among themselves before they could fully process it. The conversation resumed in the careful register of people stepping back from a ledge. Kael remained in the cluster for 2 minutes until the conversation had found its normal level, and then excused himself with the standard social acknowledgement of someone moving to speak to another group, and walked south along the main garden path. He was approximately 20 feet down the path when he became aware, through the passive spatial sense, of something he had not anticipated. Seraphine Voss was standing near the carved stone bench on the garden's south side, 20 feet to his left, with a group of 3 people, a House Voss associate, one of the Academy's senior faculty, and someone he identified as a House Stormwall representative. They had clearly been mid-conversation. He did not look directly at her. He walked the main path at a pace consistent with moving to a new conversation. The spatial sense registered the precise quality of her attention, which had been elsewhere and was now oriented in his direction. He did not factor in what happened next, which was not something he had a framework for in advance. She laughed. Not the social laugh, the calibrated response that people in Seraphine's position deployed at correct intervals during social events to signal appropriate engagement. Not that. This was a different thing, with a different quality, something that had arrived before she could direct it, brief and genuine and immediately suppressed into the controlled composure that was her standard setting. Approximately 3 seconds, possibly less. He registered it. He kept walking. He reached the far section of the path near the stone planting bed and stood there looking at the June garden with the specific quality of no plan in particular, which was unusual for him and which did not feel wrong. He thought about the 3 financial irregularities, which he had been holding in reserve since year 10. He thought about the Duke's face and the 2 frontier lords' careful stillness and the cluster of people adjacent to the cluster who had heard without appearing to hear. He thought about Aldrich's hand on his shoulder at the ceremony gate, in the morning, and at the ceremony itself, and again in the garden, and the way his father had looked at him before he began speaking. He thought about Seraphine laughing before her mind caught up to her impulse, in the middle of a house storm wall conversation, because something involuntary had arrived and she had been unable to fully contain it in the half-second window. He had not caused this directly. He had said 3 things from memory, and they happened to be the things that were available to say. The laugh was not something he had planned for. But the laugh was real, which meant it was data, in the way everything was data, except that he registered this particular piece of data differently from how he registered most data, in a way that he did not immediately classify. He filed it without the classification and looked at the garden. The June light was doing what June light did at this hour, long and amber, the particular quality of afternoon moving to evening that made the formal garden look like it was lit from within rather than from outside. The ornamental trees were past flowering now, in the full green of the season's main body. The celebration continued around him, families and graduates and the ambient sound of an occasion that was both ending and becoming something else. The academy was behind him. 3 years of the double life, the official record and the actual one, running in parallel, sharing the same building and the same days and the same rooms without ever fully occupying them in the same register. The Ashford barony was ahead of him. What came after the barony was what he had been building toward for 3 years. His father found him at the stone bench 15 minutes later. Aldrich sat beside him and looked at the garden and did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "You've been busy." Kael said, "Yes." Aldrich said, "The mine surveys. The Frontier Compact. The journalism last autumn." He paused. "The Duke." Kael said, "They took a long time to put together." Aldrich was quiet. Then he said, in the tone that he used when he was being precise, "I don't understand all of it. I think I understand some of it." Another pause. "I'm proud of you. That is not contingent on whether I understand it." Kael looked at the garden. He said, "I know." The reception continued until the light changed to the softer register of early evening. He spent the remaining time moving through the social geometry with his father, doing the small necessary work of a graduation event, the conversations that closed things properly, the acknowledgments that made the transition from this stage to the next legible. He was good at this. He had always been good at this. When the last guests were departing and the garden was returning to its institutional quiet, he stood at the academy's east gate with his father and looked back at the building. It was a building. He had used it. It had been a good building for the purpose. He said, "Ready." His father said, "Yes." They left.